You know, over the past few years, we've seen a lot of animals trying to make successful indie games. We got Undertale by a fox, Stardew by an ape, and now we got a bird doing the same thing with its new game, Eastward. Listen, I've never played a top-down adventure game inspired by the 16-bit era made with so much polish like Eastward. The moment you turn it on, you already know that the people who made this game poured their hearts and soul into making this thing come to life, man. In Eastward, you play as John, a real silent type dude, and then you got Sam, little white hair Sam, little bean Sam, little cute Sam. As they head east, coming up from a place where the outside was nothing but legend, and as they head east, the story unravels, like what happened to the world before them, and who the heck is this girl in the pod? Probably nobody important. The game plays like
Big game pizza pigskin. Awesome!
Yeah, hungry, got me in a grapple.
like it was born out of the Super Nintendo era, man. You got the 90s vibe all over. You got John over here with his legendary frying pan. Swap out, blam. You got a gun. Swap again, you got a flameo. Swap again, you got this trigonometry buzzsaw shooting thing. And then you got bombs that do this, and bombs that do that. And then you switch, you got Sam and her mysterious bubbles, clearly a throwback to Bubbles from Bulbasaur. You can freeze a dude, you can do an area thing, you can kill a muck guy with a super Kamehameha. There's the super duo dynamic with the two characters where you swap between each other. First you stun a dude with a bubble with Sam, and then swap to John with a super combo frying pan, and oh my god, this game just works. In combat, you gotta be careful and methodical. You gotta bob and weave, you gotta know the end lag of your attacks, because these guys can clap you if you're not careful. And it's always a good sign of a good combat if you can't bum rush your way into a victory. That's not to say that the combat in this game is perfect either. There are many little annoying things that pop out from time to time, like when you're walking and then those guys spawn underneath you for some reason, like get the heck out of my way, you stupid slugs. And how the aiming is directly tied to your left stick and it's inaccurate as heck. Now those are little gripes, but they are minor as heck and don't break the game for me. And I have to say, the game is actually pretty nicely balanced. I don't think I have ever felt that the game has been unfair to me in terms of pacing combat wise. While I feel like adding modern combat features would have been nice for this game, it's not really necessary. I could easily picture this game with a dodge roll, but I figured if they added that, it wouldn't be that much of a homage to the old generation, so I don't knock it for that design decision. I actually commend it. Now, I touched on the duo dynamic for combat earlier, but they function outside of combat. You thought it was just for freaking combat? Nah, man. You got bombs by John, who strangely has a bomb for every situation. And then you got Sam with the light show with the bubbles. Now, I don't know where those things came from, but they can surely take care of the roadblocks like these plants and all those weird mushrooms. They can also detach from each other and use their specific skills to solve separate puzzles in different areas, which makes me think of Goof Troop a little bit. But really, if you sit back and think about it, you only have limited ways to interact with the world, basically through John's weapons and Sam's bubbles, and that's it. But if you think that's not enough traversal mechanics, Eastward switches it up by making the mechanics for our leads interact different ways to different parts of the game. Like when you use your frying pan to go up to this thing and you just smack it and it just pushes you off. Or Sam using her bubbles to light up a switch in the Temple of Time sort of thing. And let's not forget about the bombs, because John has a bomb for every situation, and that's traversal too. Now it's kinda neat how they get so much mileage on so little add-on mechanics compared to something like a 2D Zelda, which gives you so many traversal tools and extra items. But the game doesn't really need extra items either. The pacing for combat and reveals for new items is so good that adding any more would just make it fluff. But to keep things fresh, Eastward will throw a curveball here and there to change things up, and man, some of these switch ups are really hilarious, like this Dragon Quest game inside the game you're already playing, or the super fast Jeep boat ride. Yes, a Jeep boat. Or this part in the monkey train with the Hollywood monkeys that need extra actors, so you become the lead role in this Hollywood thing with aliens and the monkeys are getting invaded and what the. And speaking of well-made things, the dungeon maps of this game are really well designed. Not overly complicated and not overly long. It's a good balance of puzzles and fighting and good exploration bits. Nothing says good pacing like when you're going through a dungeon and just when it almost gets tedious, the boss appears, or the dungeon ends. You know, one thing that this game does really well, other than the art, because everybody knows about the art, but one thing this game does really well is make really good paced dungeons. Now we can talk about the game's overall pacing all day, we can talk about that later, but I'm just saying, game's dungeon pacing is really good and it should get high marks for that. Now, at the end of these really well-designed dungeons are the bosses, and some of them are really fun and well-designed. Each boss has their own conceit to them, like this digging almudron thingy, fish, or this giant hermit crab that reacts to the steam. Each boss has its own unique way to be taken down, usually by a power-up you get in the area. And every boss will test you on your mastery of the mechanics you learned. So you better remember how to do the trigonometry weapon. Now, there are highs and lows when it comes to bosses in this game. Not everything is going to turn out perfect, but definitely the last two bosses in this game are the best. So at the very least, you get a very strong climax in terms of gravity, in terms of narrative weight. So the bosses in this game will leave you pretty satisfied for the most part. Now, the game stands on its own just fine, but for the people who played older games, you'll definitely see a lot of inspiration being drawn. I'm seeing flashes of Zelda in the puzzles, mana in the combat, flashes of Chrono Trigger in the story, and even a tinge of modern inspiration with the other mechanics. And while the gameplay may not be as varied as I would have wanted, the game has polished its existing mechanics to its highest potential. They went max level with this thing, man. They went level 100. So, the way I'd like to think about how to quantify the value of an experience in a game is I'd like to do a knife analogy. It'll make sense, I promise. See, a AAA game would be like a Swiss Army knife. Lots of different useful tools, lots of different experiences, a lot of them really polished. And indie games would be more likened to a really sharp knife. And while it may not have the variety of a multi-tool, if you're looking for something specific to slice your carrots with, a really sharp knife will serve you just as fine. It's not to say that Eastward only does one thing well, as I've said in this video, but if there's anything you can point out in this game that really stands out, it's the art. Man, I can't even begin to describe it, man. This game is a treat to the eyes. I mean, every single detail of this pixelated world is just breathing with life. The grass sways from side to side, the wind vanes turn, and there's lighting, and there's fireflies that glow around the river. The meticulous level of detail in this game, man, where nothing ever feels like it was cut and paste from a template. Like every piece of this world was handcrafted with love. Square Enix and your HD 2D, meet Eastward. Speaking of detail, all the NPCs, with the exception of the goons, have their own design. Every single one of them has their own personality and life, even though they're just one-off characters that you may never see again. It's so weird. It's really hard to distinguish which characters are the random townsfolk and which ones have a specific role to play in the story, because they all look unique. Like, who's this guy? While the game's detail is beyond amazing, the world may feel a little bit smaller than you might expect. See, you get your bright and colorful multi-section towns and the dungeons that help bring the length of the game up with the mazes and puzzles, but the world itself isn't really that big. The game is broken down into chapters, and each chapter puts you in a different area. You can't really go back to the previous areas, which eliminates a whole lot of backtracking and padding, but because of that, the world feels crammed and disjointed. It doesn't flow into one like, let's say, Link to the Past or something like that. But narratively, getting rid of the backtracking gives Eastward this feeling of impermanence, and it's actually quite fitting for the type of story Eastward is trying to tell. And now, about the story. When you talk about story, especially in games, you just can't talk about the plot. You know, it's the delivery that's important. And Eastward's story is decent, but the execution is, well... Whoa. You're introduced to this world half destroyed and the people picking up the pieces. But wait, you gotta pick up some fruit first, cause I hear this guy's hungry. Then you have this mysterious girl in the pod Who is she and what is her connection to Nah, forget about that. We gotta talk to this clown first. These are by no means bad scenes. They're actually pretty fun if you just let it ride out. But we all want to move along. We want to get to the meaty part of this story, you know? I don't want to watch some S&M lady hanging around, and I don't need to care about this guy's diet, and I certainly don't want to see the hot spring scene. I like the hot spring scene. But these could have easily been side missions, man. But nah, you gotta experience the writing, bro. You gotta experience everything. You know, this could have been solved if it were more of an open RPG. But since you can't backtrack, the game is forced to keep the story rolling and moving on to the next beat. But I don't know if having every story beat as a mandatory cutscene is the answer to that problem. I mean, why couldn't you just have faith in your game? Enough to let players discover these cutscenes for themselves instead of shoving every single story beat down their throat. I mean, is this really the best way you could have done it? I don't know, man. I mean, I like the story for the most part. The pacing is just wonky. There's also this mystery that they built up in the background, something that you can liken to Earthbound, but I think it wasn't as cleanly executed here. Not every mystery is tied together as strongly. I still found it enjoyable, but I think Undertale set the bar for the iceberg mystery thing. And we're in the age of the internet where, you know, internet sleuths and people smarter than me will connect all the dots, and I'm willing to take an L on this one if somebody argues against my case. So that's all I can say about the story and plot. But one thing I really liked about this game are the characters. The characters in this game are well realized. You only get to play as Sam and John, but you'll meet a plethora of side characters along the way, and mostly all of them are memorable and undergo a character arc as you change the world around them. I mean, I did have a problem with a certain love interest that, if you play the game, you'll know what I'm talking about. It was kind of rushed and didn't feel as fulfilling, but, you know, beyond that, most of the major side characters were fun as heck. My favorite has got to be Alva. She has a quirky, childlike nature that just functions as a mask for a lot of her anxiety, and I love her. She really cared about Sam. And speaking of Sam, she's a great companion to John, who doesn't speak much. The story flows through her and we kind of get roped along in her shenanigans, but she's also a cute little lovable bean who can hold her own, so she doesn't fall into the trap of becoming that annoying kid companion. Overall, I applaud Eastward for creating enjoyable characters, even though some of it was, you know, slice of life filler that was kind of mandatory for us to clear. I wouldn't have continued if the characters were at the very least interesting. So even if the whole story ended up disjointed, the adventures I had with these characters were really good. Eastward overall was a wild ride of a game. Amazing art you can't help but admire, and gameplay elements that are really well tuned and polished. Story has some pacing issues, but the characters are amazing, and yeah, I had fun with this game. Mr. Bird has earned my good graces, and I hope their next game will be just as good. Hopefully it doesn't take 10 years to finish, but you know how it is. Now, I don't have a rating system, but if I did, this game could settle in a solid A. It's a very well polished game, and the 7 years were worth the effort. I mean, it looks gorgeous. The gameplay is also solid because it's grounded on the solid roots of the 90s. But even still, the game has its own personality that stands on its own. The story is solid, and while I have problems with the pacing, the story is like decent overall. And the characters, well, really lovable. And I'm not even kidding, man. Even if everything about this game sucked, it would still get a passing grade for the art direction and the detail in my book. So, having the solid gameplay is just cherry on top that pushes it over to a bigger grade. So, overall, Eastward is a solid lowercase a, for whatever that means. And to be honest, I was gonna give it a bigger score. But first, we gotta talk to these clowns.
Wait, you're doing a review when you haven't touched Delta in Chapter 2, you wanker.